I still remember the day I found the ad. I'd just moved to the city, broke and desperate for a place to live. Roommate wanted, low rent, utilities included was plastered in big, inviting letters across the flyer. It was too good to be true, I thought, but then again, wasn't everything? So I called the number, met with Dan, and before I knew it, I was signing a lease. Dan was tall, lanky, with eyes that rarely made contact. He kept his head down as he handed me the key, murmuring that I was free to move in whenever I liked. The apartment was old, with yellowed wallpaper peeling off in patches, and the floors creaked like they were crying out for help. But it was cheap and mine. On the first night, as I lay on my mattress in the empty room, I heard Dan moving around in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps went from one end to the other, back and forth, back and forth. It was almost like he was pacing. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was nervous, or maybe he was a night owl. The strange noises only grew worse as days passed. I'd wake up to faint whispers outside my door, like he was talking to someone. When I asked him about it, he just laughed, his eyes flicking to the door as he said, "Oh, you know how old buildings are. They make all kinds of sounds." But there was a glint in his eye, something dark, something that made my stomach churn. One night, I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of scratching. It was coming from the walls, right by the head of my bed. It was soft at first, almost like a mouse, but it grew louder, sharper, like claws dragging along the plaster. I lay there, frozen, trying to convince myself it was just rats or the old pipes. But then I heard it, whispering, low and frantic, almost as if it was inside the wall. The voice was muffled, but I could make out some of the words. "Help me." My body went cold. I shot up, pressing my ear to the wall. There it was again, faint but unmistakable. "Help me." The voice was desperate, pleading. I stumbled out of bed and into the hallway, heart pounding. Dan's room was at the other end of the hall, his door slightly ajar. The light inside was dim, casting strange shadows across the floor. I crept towards his room and the whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from Dan's room. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. And it wasn't one voice anymore. It was multiple, all tangled together in a twisted harmony of pleas and sobs. My skin crawled, and just as I was about to back away, Dan's door swung open. He was standing there, his face blank, his eyes dark pits that seemed to swallow the dim light. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice calm, almost bored. I forced a smile, muttering something about the noise. He just stared at me, silent, his gaze never breaking. I felt like he was seeing right through me, like he could see every tremor of fear in my body. Finally, he stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. Want to see something? Against every instinct screaming inside me, I followed him into his room. It was bare except for a mattress on the floor and a small lamp that cast an eerie yellow glow. But what caught my attention was the floor. It was covered in strange symbols, drawn in what looked like chalk, smeared and faded in places. The symbols were bizarre, twisted shapes that seemed to shift and writhe if I stared too long. "Dan, what is this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He looked at the floor, shrugging nonchalantly. "Just something I found. The last guy who lived here, he left it behind." He said it so casually, like he was talking about a forgotten book. I took a step back, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Where is he now?" I asked, my voice shaking. Dan's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something flicker there. Fear, maybe, or guilt. Gone. Just vanished. Never even came back for his things. His mouth twitched in a mock smile. Guess he didn't like the rent. I turned to leave, but his hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "You'll stay, won't you?" His voice was soft, almost pleading. "You're different. They won't bother you as much." I yanked my hand free, stumbling back into the hallway, heart racing. I locked myself in my room, just pressing my ear to the wall. The whispers were back, louder now. Desperate, I heard my own name. "Please help us." I felt like I was losing my mind. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The next day, I confronted Dan. I told him I was moving out, that I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. His face twisted, anger flashing in his eyes, and he grabbed my arm, harder this time, his nails digging into my skin. "You can't leave," he hissed, his voice low, dangerous. "If you leave, they'll come after you." I shoved him away, grabbed my bag, and bolted for the door. As I ran down the hallway, I heard the whispers again, louder than ever, filling the entire apartment. They followed me, growing louder, overlapping, a chorus of despair that seemed to echo through the walls. I didn't stop running until I was out on the street, gasping for air. I could still hear them, faintly, like they'd followed me out. I moved in with a friend that night, but the nightmares started soon after. Every night, I'd wake up to the sound of scratching, faint whispers filling my room. I tried to move again, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. Every night, they came back, whispering my name, pleading for help. I went back to the building once, desperate to confront Dan to make it stop. But when I got there, the landlord told me something that made my blood run cold. Dan? There hasn't been a Dan in that apartment for years. I stared at him, heart pounding, trying to process his words. What do you mean? I stammered. The landlord's face was grave, his eyes dark. The last guy who lived there disappeared. The cops found strange symbols in his room, marks on the walls, scratches. The tenants after him complained about voices too, but when they went to find him, he was gone. It's like that room swallows people whole. I left that day, feeling their eyes on me, their whispers following. I never went back, but I still hear them, every night, louder and louder, as if they're drawing closer, waiting for me to join them in that cursed room. And I know, deep down, that they won't stop. Not until I do. I'll never forget the winter I lived with Daniel and Katie. We'd all just graduated and moved into a huge, creaky house on the edge of the city. The rent was cheap because the place was old and falling apart, but we didn't care. It felt like an adventure, the kind of place you'd tell stories about years later. Little did I know that winter would give me nightmares I'd carry with me forever. It started with little things. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the staircase. I assumed it was Daniel or Katie, but when I peeked into the hallway, no one was there. The next morning, over coffee, I mentioned it casually. Daniel just shrugged, but Katie looked thoughtful. I heard it too, she admitted, looking pale. Like someone walking slowly up the stairs, right? A chill settled over me, but we brushed it off. Old houses make noises. That's just how it is, we told ourselves. But things got stranger. About a week later, Katie told us she'd woken up to the sound of someone breathing in her room. She turned on the light, expecting to see one of us playing a prank. But she was alone. She swore she could still hear it. Slow, deep breaths, just a few feet from her bed. When she told us, Daniel tried to laugh it off, but I could see the unease in his eyes. None of us wanted to admit we were scared. The next night, I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. The room felt wrong, heavy, like something was watching me. I lay there, perfectly still, trying to calm my breathing. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of scratching, coming from the wall right behind my headboard. It was slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was clawing its way through the wall. I sat up, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was a rat or something caught in the walls. But the scratching stopped the moment I moved. It was as if it knew I was listening. For days, we all tiptoed around each other, trying to pretend everything was normal. We'd hear footsteps echoing down the hall when we were all in the living room, lights flickering in empty rooms, the feeling of icy cold air rushing past even though all the windows were shut tight. Katie looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn. She confessed that she hadn't been able to sleep in days because she kept hearing whispers. I tried to console her, but part of me was relieved it wasn't just happening to me. Then, one night, everything came to a head. I woke up to the sound of shuffling footsteps outside my bedroom door. I sat up, listening, straining to hear. They were slow, dragging, like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. I reached for my phone to check the time, 3:17 a.m. My heart pounded as I listened to the footsteps stop outside my door. I held my breath, barely daring to move, but after a moment they continued, making their way down the hallway. The footsteps stopped again, this time outside Katie's door. I scrambled out of bed, quietly tiptoeing to my door to peek into the hallway. My breath caught. There, standing just outside her room, was a shadow, a figure, tall and dark, barely illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlight outside. I thought it was Daniel, but something about the way it stood, motionless, hunched over, sent waves of fear through me. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. Just as I was about to step back, Katie's door slowly creaked open. I watched in horror as the shadow slipped into her room, the door closing softly behind it. I ran down the hallway, banging on Daniel's door, desperate to wake him up. He stumbled out, rubbing his eyes, but before I could explain, a blood-curdling scream erupted from Katie's room. We burst through her door to find her sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror, tears streaming down her face. She was staring at the foot of her bed, her hand outstretched as if reaching for something invisible, but there was nothing there. She wouldn't stop screaming, her voice growing hoarse, until Daniel managed to shake her out of it. She looked at us, wild-eyed, gasping for breath. "It was here. It was right here," she whispered, clutching the blankets to her chest. I felt it crawl onto the bed. It touched me. That night, we all huddled together in the living room, terrified and too afraid to sleep. Katie wouldn't say another word, just stared at the floor, rocking slightly, as if she was in shock. Daniel and I took turns watching the hallway, dreading the thought of seeing that shadow again. The next day, Katie packed her things and left, refusing to even stay another night. Daniel and I tried to stick it out, but the atmosphere in the house grew darker, heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in on us. I kept hearing whispers, faint but unmistakable, and sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. I'd turn to look, but nothing was ever there. One night, after Daniel left to stay with his parents, I was alone in the house. I tried to convince myself I'd be fine, that it was all in my head. But around midnight, the scratching started again, louder this time, coming from every wall like something was trying to claw its way in. The air grew cold, colder than it had ever been, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. Then the footsteps began, slow and heavy, making their way towards my room. I bolted, grabbing my keys and running out into the night without looking back. I didn't even lock the door. I just drove, not stopping until I was miles away, heart still racing. I never went back to the house. I sent movers to get my things, and I never spoke to Daniel or Katie again. I didn't want to hear their stories. I didn't want to know if it had followed them too. To this day, I still hear it sometimes, a faint scratching in the walls, a shadow moving just out of sight. I tell myself it's nothing, that it's just my imagination. But deep down, I know that whatever was in that house is still out there, waiting, watching, lurking in the dark, waiting for the moment it can creep in again. I was only supposed to be there a few weeks. My friend Eric had a basement apartment in an old brownstone, and since he was traveling for work, he'd offered it to me while I was in town. It was perfect, close to everything, rent-free, and I'd have the whole place to myself. But Eric had barely been gone a day when I began to understand why he might have wanted to get away from that place. The first night, I woke up to a tapping sound, like fingers drumming on wood. It was faint at first, barely enough to pull me out of sleep, but it didn't stop. I sat up in bed, looking around in the dim light, heart thumping. The room was dark, shadowed in deep blues and grays, and I could barely see the outline of the furniture. But there, in the far corner of the room, I thought I saw something. A dark shape hunched over, shifting slightly. I blinked, my pulse quickening, and when I opened my eyes, it was gone. Just shadows, I told myself, trying to calm down. Just an old basement playing tricks in the night. But the tapping continued, faint but deliberate, moving slowly across the walls, like something creeping its way around the room. I told myself it was just the pipes or the building settling, but deep down, I knew something felt wrong. The next night, the temperature dropped sharply, colder than I'd ever felt indoors. I grabbed a blanket, huddling up on the couch, and tried to watch TV to distract myself. But around midnight, the TV began flickering, static cutting in and out, warping the screen until I could barely see the image. Frustrated, I turned it off, the apartment falling into silence. But the silence didn't last. Soon I heard it again. That same tapping, rhythmic, as if it were moving from one room to another, coming closer. I strained to listen, heart pounding, and then something caught my eye. A shadow flitting across the hallway, just for a second before disappearing. I was certain I was alone, but the hair on my arm stood up, my skin prickling with a sense of dread. I slowly stood, inching my way toward the hallway, even though every instinct told me to stay put. As I reached the doorway, the tapping stopped. The air grew thick, pressing down on me, and a strange smell wafted through the hallway, a damp, earthy smell, like something rotting deep underground. That's when I heard it, a soft, raspy voice whispering my name. I froze, my mouth going dry. The whisper was close, too close, and seemed to echo from every direction. I forced myself to step forward, heart racing, trying to remind myself that I didn't believe in ghosts. But the smell intensified, filling my lungs, and as I turned the corner, I saw it. A dark figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was taller than I'd first thought, its head nearly touching the ceiling. Its shape was wrong, distorted, its limbs too long and too thin, like it was stretched out. The figure tilted its head, its eyes, or the dark hollows where its eyes should have been, staring right at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as it took a slow, shuffling step forward. The light from the living room flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. The figure raised a hand, long fingers stretching toward me, curling and uncurling, as if it were beckoning. My whole body was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It took another step, closer now, the air growing colder, my breath fogging in front of me. Somehow, I managed to turn and run, slamming the door to my room and locking it. I pressed my back against it, heart hammering, listening as the tapping resumed, louder this time, echoing right outside my door. I could hear it dragging its fingers along the wood, scraping as if testing the barrier between us. I barely slept that night, listening to the scratching and waiting for it to stop. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty, but deep scratch marks scored the wood, like claws dragging across it. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and dread. I barely left the apartment, too afraid to come back to find it waiting. The lights would flicker, the shadows in the corners would shift, and always the smell would return like the scent of an open grave. Every night I heard the tapping, the whispers, calling my name in a voice that sounded too close, too familiar. Finally, one evening, I called Eric. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know if he'd experienced the same thing. When he answered, I could hear the tension in his voice, the hesitation. He didn't seem surprised by my story. Instead, he listened quietly, as if he'd heard it all before. Did you ever notice anything strange about the basement? I asked, my voice shaking. There was a long pause, and then Eric sighed. I didn't want to scare you, he said finally, but yeah, I've seen things. Sometimes I'd wake up to scratching, and I'd find marks on the walls, like claw marks. His voice grew softer, almost a whisper. That's why I never stayed there alone. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. Why didn't you say something? Because it's worse when you talk about it, he replied, his voice barely audible. It feeds off fear. The more you notice it, the stronger it gets. The line crackled, and suddenly I heard it again, that same raspy voice whispering my name. Only this time it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the phone. Eric, I whispered, my hand trembling, but the line was silent, dead. I pulled the phone away, staring at the screen. The call had ended, but the whisper was still there, faint and mocking, echoing from the speaker. And then slowly the whisper turned into a low, rumbling laugh. I dropped the phone, backing away, my heart racing. I ran out of the apartment, not even stopping to grab my things. I never went back. I couldn't. Even now, I still hear it sometimes, faint and distant, that raspy voice whispering my name as if it's calling me back to that cursed basement, waiting for me to finally answer. The night I moved into my new apartment, I told myself the noises were just a part of city life. I was used to suburbs and the constant hum of traffic, the creaks of an old building. It was all new to me. But as the days passed, I began to notice a strange pattern. Every night around 2 a.m., I'd hear a soft knock, knock, knock coming from somewhere in my apartment. At first, I thought it was the neighbors, or maybe pipes shifting, but it was always at the exact same time, and always 3 slow, deliberate knocks. After a week of restless nights, I mentioned it to my downstairs neighbor, a woman named Maria. She looked up from her groceries, her face immediately pale, and gave me a strange look. "You're in apartment 8B, right?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. I nodded, confused. Maria glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening. "No one's been able to stay in that apartment for long. Everyone says it's haunted. People leave all the time, move out in the middle of the night, won't say why. Most of the neighbors just don't talk about it." I laughed it off, telling myself it was just superstition. But that night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. The noise was louder this time, almost like it was coming from inside the walls. I tried to ignore it, rolling over and pulling the blanket over my head. But then I felt it. a cold, clammy feeling like something wet and icy sliding across my arm. My skin went cold, and I sat up, looking around, but the room was empty. The next morning, I noticed something strange on my nightstand. 3 small, dark smudges, like faint fingerprints, were pressed into the wood. I scrubbed them off, telling myself I must have left them there without realizing. But in the back of my mind, Maria's words nagged at me. A few nights later, I woke up again to the knocking. Only this time, it was right outside my bedroom door. Knock, knock, knock. It was slow, steady, like someone or something was testing the door, waiting for an answer. I held my breath, heart racing, my whole body tense as I listened. And then, just as I thought it had stopped, the doorknob rattled, softly, like someone was turning it from the other side. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, paralyzed with fear. Slowly, the doorknob stopped moving, and the room fell silent. But just as I started to relax, I heard a soft scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across the wood. I couldn't take it anymore. I leapt out of bed, threw open the door, and looked into the hallway, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the hallway was empty, silent, stretching out in either direction. I turned on every light, my heart still pounding, and stayed awake until dawn, unwilling to close my eyes again. The next day, I asked Maria if she'd ever experienced anything strange in her apartment. She looked at me, eyes wide, and then shook her head. I've heard things, sure. Knocks, sometimes, whispers. But it only gets bad in 8B. Everyone knows that. She hesitated, then said quietly, "There was a woman who lived there a few years back. She used to say someone visited her every night. She started talking about seeing things. Said there was a shadow watching her. Did anything happen to her?" I asked, dread building in my stomach. "She moved out in the middle of the night," Maria replied, shivering, but not before she started acting strange. She said it wasn't just knocking anymore, that it would come closer each night until she could see it. She claimed it followed her, even after she left. That night I lay in bed trying to stay calm, but at exactly 2 a.m., the knocking started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. It sounded like someone was right on the other side of the wall, pounding slowly, rhythmically, like they were letting me know they were there. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes and clenching my fists, but then I felt that same icy, damp touch on my arm. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I scrambled out of bed and flipped on the lights. The room was empty, but when I looked down, I saw it, clear as day. 3 dark, dripping fingerprints on my sheets, like someone with wet, muddy hands had pressed their fingers into the fabric. I tried to wipe them away, but they wouldn't budge as if they were burned into the cloth. The next morning, I called the landlord, demanding an explanation. He sighed, and there was a long pause before he said, "You're not the first to ask, but there's nothing in the records. Nothing official, anyway. But..." He hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Years ago, a woman named Lucy lived in that apartment. She drowned in her bathtub. The neighbors said she was paranoid, claimed someone was watching her. She used to talk about hearing knocks, about feeling something cold touch her at night. But everyone thought she was just losing her mind." He hung up after that, leaving me in a stunned silence. I spent the day pacing the apartment, checking every corner, every shadow, every wall, but found nothing. I was starting to feel foolish, convinced it was all in my head, until that night. As soon as 2 a.m. rolled around, the knocking started, but this time it was everywhere. Walls, doors, the ceiling, all echoing that same steady rhythm. My heart was racing, the air thick with that same damp, icy chill, and then out of nowhere I heard a whisper. It was so faint, barely a breath, but unmistakable. "Let me in." My throat went dry, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of there. But I couldn't move, frozen in place as the knocking grew louder, more desperate, like someone was trying to break through the walls. The air grew colder, pressing down on me, and I felt something brush past me, a cold, wet touch, like icy fingers trailing across my arm. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and then I saw it. A faint, shadowy figure standing by my bedroom door. Its shape was wrong, elongated, like it was stretched thin, and its eyes were dark, empty holes staring right at me. It took a slow, shuffling step forward, and I could feel its cold presence filling the room, suffocating me. I don't remember how I got out. All I know is that I ended up on the street, shaking, with nothing but my keys and my phone in my hand. I never went back to that apartment. I left everything I owned behind, breaking the lease, refusing to even step foot in the building again. I'd like to say it's over, that leaving was enough to escape it. But every now and then, in the dead of night, I still hear it, the faint sound of knocking, slow and steady, like it's just outside my door, waiting for me to finally let it in. When I first moved in with Paul, my new roommate, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The apartment was spacious, close to work, and cheap, a rare find in the city. Paul was quiet and kept to himself, which was perfect since I'd never been great at handling small talk. The only rule he gave me was straightforward: do not go into the back room. He said it belonged to his brother, who had left for a long trip and wouldn't want anyone in there. I thought it was a little odd, but I didn't pry. For the first few days, everything was fine. But as the week wore on, strange things started happening. Every night, just after midnight, I'd hear sounds coming from the back room, a faint scraping, like something dragging across the floor. At first, I thought it was a rat or some sort of pest, but it was too rhythmic, too steady. One night, I gathered up the courage to mention it to Paul, but he brushed it off, saying, "Old buildings make sounds. Don't worry about it." But it was hard not to worry. The noises became more persistent, and I began to notice a smell. Faint at first, but growing stronger each night. A stale, musty odor that clung to the air no matter how often I aired out the apartment. Worse, I started finding small, dirty footprints just outside the door to the back room, leading out into the hallway and disappearing halfway through the apartment. They looked too small to belong to Paul. One night, I woke up around 1 a.m. to the unmistakable sound of whispering. It was low, barely audible, and seemed to seep through the walls, growing louder the more I tried to ignore it. I could almost make out words, though they were warped and distorted, as if spoken from underwater. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening as the whispers drifted in and out, mingling with the scraping sounds from the back room. The whispers stopped just as suddenly as they started, leaving an eerie silence that felt even worse. The next day, I finally confronted Paul. He looked tired, his face pale, as if he hadn't been sleeping either. I told him about the sounds, the smell, the footprints, and to my surprise, his expression changed from irritation to something like fear. He avoided my gaze and muttered, "Just ignore it. I told you. Don't go in there." That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I lay in bed, trying to ignore the sounds, but the whispers were louder now, echoing through the apartment. My heart raced, and I decided that I had to know. I had to see what was in that room. I tiptoed down the hallway, each step feeling heavier as I approached the door. The air grew colder, and the smell hit me, thick and nauseating like rot. I hesitated, but the whispering grew louder, almost urging me forward. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle, half expecting it to be locked. But to my surprise, it turned easily, and the door swung open. The room was dark, the only light coming from a narrow window covered in grime. The smell was overwhelming, and I had to fight the urge to gag. As my eyes adjusted, I saw what looked like a mattress on the floor, old and stained. But that wasn't the worst part. In the corner of the room, a figure crouched, facing the wall. Its body was hunched, arms wrapped tightly around its knees, and it rocked slowly back and forth. My heart pounded as I realized it was wearing clothes, dirty and torn, like it had been there for a long time. And then I noticed its feet, bare and covered in dirt, perfectly matching the footprints I'd been finding in the hallway. I took a shaky step back, a floorboard creaking underfoot. The figure stopped rocking. Slowly it turned its head toward me, and I felt a chill run through my body. Its eyes were wide, hollow, staring, and its mouth hung open as if in a silent scream. Then it moved, crawling toward me with unnatural speed, hands clawing at the floor, dragging its body forward. I stumbled backwards, slamming the door shut, and ran back to my room, heart hammering in my chest. I could hear it scratching at the door, pounding against it, the whispers now furious and frenzied. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I packed my things, ready to leave, but Paul was waiting for me in the kitchen. His face was unreadable, eyes dark and hollow. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what to say, too shaken to even process what had happened. Paul sighed, looking almost relieved. "That's my brother," he said quietly. "He's been sick. I tried to keep him in there, away from everyone. He gets angry if anyone disturbs him. I didn't want anyone to know. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You're telling me he's alive? I asked, horrified. That he's been living in there like some kind of animal? Paul just looked at me, his face expressionless. He's not exactly alive, he said slowly. Not anymore. But he won't leave either. I left without another word, too afraid to look back. I moved out that day, breaking the lease and refusing to return for my belongings. I don't know what I saw in that room, but I still hear it sometimes, faint whispers echoing in my mind, like it's calling me back. To this day, I wonder if Paul ever found another roommate, or if his brother is still in that room, waiting, scratching at the walls, desperate for someone else to let him out. The job listing sounded too good to be true. Looking for an apartment sitter. Free rent, utilities covered, private unit. Just keep an eye on the place. I just graduated and was struggling to find something I could afford, so I jumped at the chance. When I arrived to meet the owner, a stern older man named Mr. Calloway, he handed me the keys, gave me a few ground rules, and mentioned one last thing. Don't worry if you hear noises from the bedroom closet at night. This is an old building, and sound travels in strange ways. I laughed, assuming it was just a quirk of the place. The apartment itself was beautiful, though a bit old-fashioned. Dark wood floors, high ceilings, and an old grandfather clock ticking away in the living room. That first night, everything was quiet. I didn't think about Mr. Calloway's warning until the clock struck midnight. The apartment was silent, except for the clock's soft ticking, but then I heard it, a faint rustling coming from the bedroom closet. It sounded like something was shifting, shuffling around just behind the door. I froze, heart pounding, as the sound grew louder, like soft footsteps scuffling back and forth. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling, maybe a draft moving something inside, but the steps continued, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. I finally gathered the courage to check. I slowly opened the closet door, half expecting to find an animal or something that had gotten trapped inside, but the closet was empty. I searched every corner, but nothing seemed out of place. Just clothes hanging in neat rows, boxes stacked on the top shelf. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks and went back to bed, trying to ignore the strange sense of unease. The next night, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were louder. They sounded almost impatient, like something pacing, waiting. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head, but the footsteps didn't stop. Finally, I whispered, "Hello?" My voice sounded small in the dark, but the footsteps paused. For a moment, everything was silent. Then slowly, the sound resumed, softer now, as if whatever was in there had heard me and was moving closer. The following morning, I called Mr. Calloway, telling him about the sounds. He sighed, his voice flat. "I told you not to worry about the closet," he said. "It's part of the building's charm. Don't go opening doors if you don't need to." Not quite the reassurance I was hoping for, but I didn't argue. That night, however, things escalated. Just past midnight, the footsteps started up again, louder than ever. I lay in bed, listening, heart racing, when I heard something new. A soft, faint whisper coming from the closet. The words were indistinct, a low murmur, but I could swear it was saying my name. I shot up, clutching the blankets, my breath quickening. The whisper grew louder, clearer, like someone was right behind the closet door, calling to me in a voice that was almost familiar. Against my better judgment, I got out of bed and slowly approached the closet. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. I don't know what I expected to find, but the moment I touched the handle, a chill shot through me, and the whisper stopped. The silence was thick, suffocating, as if the whole apartment was holding its breath. Then suddenly I felt a sharp, icy touch on my shoulder. I whipped around, but no one was there. The room was empty, the shadows still and silent. I backed away, my heart pounding, and shut the closet door, locking it as if that would make a difference. The rest of the night I lay awake, too terrified to close my eyes, jumping at every sound. By morning, I was exhausted, but determined to leave. I packed up my things, ready to find somewhere else, but when I tried to open the front door, it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, the lock clicked, but the door seemed jammed, refusing to open. Frantic, I called Mr. Calloway, telling him I needed to leave. His response was chilling. "I warned you about the closet," he said, his tone cold. "Now, you've stirred things up. You have to finish your stay. The apartment has rules." I demanded to know what he meant, but he only hung up. The line went dead, leaving me with no answers and a growing sense of dread. I tried the door again, pounding and yelling, but it was as if the entire apartment were sealed, trapping me inside. That night, the whispering returned, louder, angrier, filling the apartment with a soft, insistent call. My name, over and over, mixed with fragments of words strange and garbled, like someone speaking from a great distance. I covered my ears, but the voice grew louder, seeping through my hands, filling my head with its demands. I spent the entire night in the living room, refusing to go anywhere near the bedroom. But just before dawn, the closet door creaked open, its hinges groaning, and a shadow spilled out across the floor. It moved slowly, stretching across the room, dark and dense, until it seemed to fill every corner. And then, in the silence, I heard it, a soft, scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming closer, the shadow inching forward, bringing with it an icy chill that made my breath fog in the air. I pressed myself against the wall, watching as the shadow took shape, a figure with long, bony fingers, hollow eyes that seemed to suck in the light, and a mouth stretched into a silent scream. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen with terror, but by the time the sun rose, the shadow was gone, and the apartment was silent. The front door was suddenly open, the way clear as if nothing had happened. I fled, leaving everything behind, stumbling out into the daylight, gasping for air. I never looked back, never contacted Mr. Calloway again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that voice, faint and distant, calling my name. And in the silence that follows, I feel a presence, lingering just behind me, waiting for the moment I'll turn around and let it back in. The ad was simple. House sitter wanted, 1 weekend, generous pay. I needed the money, and a quiet weekend in a big house sounded perfect. When I met the owner, Mrs. Finley, she seemed sweet, albeit a little distant. She didn't say much about the house, just showed me to the guest room and left with only one instruction: stay out of the basement. It sounded a little dramatic, but I didn't think much of it. Most people don't want strangers snooping around. The house itself was charming but outdated. Creaky floors, heavy curtains, and the kind of old furniture that makes you feel like you're being watched. The first night, I settled into bed with a book. Around midnight, I heard a noise. It was faint, like something shifting or dragging across the floor. I figured it was just the house settling, maybe the wind. But as I lay there, I heard it again, a low, steady thump coming from somewhere below. I told myself it was just my imagination. But as the night wore on, the noise didn't stop. It became a steady rhythm, a kind of slow, deliberate dragging sound, coming from the basement. I remembered Mrs. Finley's warning and pulled the covers over my head, trying to ignore it. The sound continued for hours, so steady it was almost hypnotic. The next morning, I went downstairs and cautiously peeked into the basement stairwell. The door was locked, which was a relief, but that didn't stop me from feeling a strange pull, a compulsion to know what was down there. I could see scratch marks around the frame, faint but there, as if someone, or something, had tried to claw its way out. Trying to ignore the unease building inside me, I went about my day, occasionally glancing at the basement door, feeling its silent presence watching me. That night, the sounds started up again, but they were louder, more insistent. It was a dragging noise, like someone pulling something heavy across the floor, punctuated by a faint tapping, as though something were hitting the walls. This time, the sound was accompanied by something even more unnerving. A voice, faint and indistinct, coming from below. It was too muffled to make out, but I could feel its urgency, a desperate, pleading tone that seemed to echo up through the floorboards. My skin crawled. I pressed my ear to the floor, and the voice grew louder, closer, as if it was right beneath me. Then it stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse, pressing down on me like a weight. I climbed into bed, pulling the blankets around me, heart racing, but sleep wouldn't come. After what felt like hours, the dragging sound returned, even louder now, accompanied by a faint knocking like someone tapping on the basement door. It was too much. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I crept down the hallway, stopping in front of the basement door, my hand hovering over the knob. Every instinct told me to turn away, but the knocking was relentless, as though someone were trapped down there, begging for help. Finally, I turned the handle, surprised to find it unlocked. The basement stairs stretched down into darkness, the air thick with a stale, sour smell. As I stepped down, the sounds grew louder, more insistent, almost frantic. I reached the bottom, my phone flashlight barely piercing the thick shadows. The basement was cold, empty, except for a single large trunk in the center of the floor, covered in dust and cobwebs. The knocking had stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from inside the trunk. My heart pounded as I approached, drawn by some unseen force, compelled to open it. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the latch. Then, with a deep breath, I unclasped it and lifted the lid. Inside was a tattered, moth-eaten wedding dress, draped over a pile of bones. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, horrified, at the skeletal remains curled up inside the trunk. The bones were small, fragile, like those of a child, and clutched in one hand was an old, rusted locket. Suddenly the air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned, my flashlight flickering, and there, in the corner of the basement, stood a figure. A woman in a wedding dress, her face pale and hollow, her eyes dark and empty. She was watching me, her gaze full of sorrow and fury, and as her mouth opened, I heard the faint whisper that had haunted me all night. "Help me." I stumbled back, scrambling up the stairs, feeling her presence following me, her whispers growing louder, more desperate. I slammed the basement door shut, locking it, and fled the house, my mind reeling with what I had seen. The next day, Mrs. Finley called, asking if I'd had a peaceful stay. My voice shook as I told her everything about the sounds, the whispers, the trunk, and the woman in the dress. There was a long pause, and then she spoke, her tone cold and detached. "My sister disappeared on her wedding day, many years ago," she said. "We searched everywhere but never found her. After she vanished, I began hearing her, late at night, calling to me. I tried to move on, but she wouldn't let go. I had the basement locked up, hoping she'd finally rest." I felt a chill run down my spine as her words sank in. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Because she was never supposed to call for anyone but me," Mrs. Finley replied, her voice distant. "I hoped maybe a stranger could break the cycle, but it seems she's still waiting." I hung up, the memory of that voice still echoing in my mind. I don't know if Mrs. Finley ever found peace, or if her sister still lingers in that basement, waiting, tapping, hoping someone will finally set her free. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the soft, steady knocking, like a distant memory that refuses to fade, a whisper that promises it's not over yet. I had never been one for living with roommates, but when my friend Andy offered me a cheap room in his new place, I couldn't turn it down. The house was old, almost forgotten by time, with heavy wooden doors and antique fixtures. It was a bit rundown, but the rent was unbeatable. The only odd thing was the door in the basement, solid, ironclad, and bolted shut. Andy was quick to tell me not to worry about it, that it led to an old wine cellar the landlord had blocked off years ago. "Just a weird quirk of the house," he shrugged. The first week went smoothly, but a few days in, I started noticing odd things around the house. Small, unsettling signs that I couldn't quite explain. I'd come into the kitchen in the morning to find drawers open, even though I was certain I'd shut them. I'd hear footsteps late at night, always around 3 a.m., slow and shuffling, as if someone were moving through the house in the dark. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like a breeze, but unmistakably voices, speaking just below the level of hearing. I froze, straining to listen, but the whispers died away, leaving only silence. I chalked it up to my imagination, an old house settling, maybe a draft in the walls. But each night, the whispers grew louder, until I could hear them clearly outside my door. It was a low, murmuring chorus, fragmented sentences, almost like chanting, but always stopping just as I got close enough to hear. I finally told Andy about it, hoping he'd laugh it off and tell me I was being ridiculous. But he just looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I've heard things too," he admitted. "It's probably nothing. Old houses make weird noises." That night, I lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the house, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread. Around 3 a.m., the footsteps started again, moving down the hallway outside my room, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped. I held my breath, listening. The silence was suffocating. Then, slowly, the footsteps began descending the stairs, one step at a time, heading toward the basement. The next morning, I asked Andy if he'd gone downstairs during the night, but he looked confused. "I never got up," he said, his face pale. "I thought I heard you." The realization that we'd both heard the footsteps sank in, filling me with an icy dread. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself drawn to the basement door. Something about it was different. An energy, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. I stepped closer, feeling a chill settle over me. The door was still bolted, but as I pressed my ear against it, I heard it. Faint, desperate scratching, as though something inside was trying to claw its way out. My heart pounded, but I couldn't look away. I felt an inexplicable pull, a compulsion to open the door, to see what was behind it. Before I could stop myself, my hands were on the bolts, loosening them one by one. But just as I reached for the final lock, a hand grabbed my shoulder. "Don't," Andy said, his voice barely a whisper. His face was pale, eyes wide with something that looked like fear. I pulled back, shaken, and watched as Andy resecured the bolts. "There's something in there," he finally admitted, his voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but I've heard it too. And whatever it is, it's angry." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the whispers that seemed louder now, almost furious, as if the thing in the basement knew we'd been close to opening the door. The house felt different, darker, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting. Around 3 a.m., the footsteps returned. But this time, they didn't stop at my door. They continued down the hall, heavier, more purposeful, and I heard the faint creak of the basement door. I held my breath, feeling an oppressive weight settle over me. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went silent. The next morning, Andy was gone. His room was empty, his belongings left untouched. I searched the entire house, calling his name, but there was no trace of him. Panicked, I called the landlord, but all he said was, "Andy moved out. He didn't tell you?" Confused and terrified, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That my roommate had been taken by something in the basement? I packed my things ready to leave, but something drew me back to the basement door, as if Andy were calling to me, begging me to help him. Against every instinct, I unlocked the bolts and swung open the door. A foul, cold air rushed out, and I had to fight the urge to turn and run. But I took a step forward, descending the stairs into the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows thicker, pressing in from all sides. At the bottom of the stairs, I found the door to the wine cellar, barely visible in the dim light. It was cracked open, just enough for me to see inside. The room was empty, save for a single mirror against the wall, ancient and covered in a thick layer of dust. I stepped closer, drawn to the mirror, even as every instinct screamed at me to turn back. As I brushed away the dust, my reflection came into view. But something was wrong. My face looked twisted, distorted, and just behind me, I saw a figure, a dark, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and an expression of rage. I stumbled back, but the figure moved closer, reaching toward me with skeletal hands. I ran, tearing up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I fled the house that night, leaving everything behind. I never heard from Andy again, and no one else seemed to know where he'd gone. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that whatever I saw in that mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was something old, something vengeful, and it was waiting. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still see it in my dreams, a shadowy figure reaching for me, whispering from the darkness, calling me back to that basement, as if it's still waiting for me to return. The ad was brief but enticing. Rural house sitter needed. 1 week, generous pay, solitude guaranteed. I'd been craving a break from the city, and the pay was just too good to ignore. The house sat on an isolated stretch of farmland surrounded by nothing but fields and forest. It was a large, old farmhouse that had clearly seen better days, its windows dark and shadowed as if watching me arrive. The owner, a tall, gaunt man with deep-set eyes, greeted me on the porch. He didn't say much beyond what was needed to explain the basics, except for one instruction. At night, if you hear knocking on the windows, ignore it. Don't look. Don't open the curtains. Just ignore it. I wanted to laugh it off, but his tone left no room for questions. "Is this some kind of prank?" I asked, half joking, trying to lighten the mood. His face remained stony. "It's for your own good. Trust me." When he left, I tried to shake off the eerie warning. The house was quiet, filled with the smell of dust and something faintly sour, like mold lurking somewhere in the walls. I settled in, exploring a bit, but the house had an unsettling energy, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for nightfall. The first evening was uneventful. The silence out there was deeper than any I'd ever experienced, almost like a blanket, heavy and thick. As night fell, I felt a creeping unease that I couldn't quite explain, so I turned in early, reminding myself to ignore the man's odd warning. Around 2 a.m., a noise jolted me awake. It was a soft tapping coming from one of the windows downstairs. I froze, the man's words echoing in my mind. If you hear knocking, ignore it. I tried to go back to sleep, telling myself it was probably just a branch or some animal. But then I heard it again, louder this time. A slow, deliberate knock, 3 times in succession. Knock, knock, knock. My heart pounded, and curiosity clawed at me, but I forced myself to stay in bed, eyes shut tight. Minutes passed in silence, and I started to relax, thinking I'd imagined it. But then the knocking started again, this time on a different window, closer to my room. I pulled the blanket over my head, heart racing. The knocking continued, moving from one window to the next, circling the house as if something were testing each window, looking for a way in. The rest of the night was a sleepless blur, punctuated by that steady, relentless knocking. By dawn, the sound had finally stopped, leaving me feeling drained and on edge. The next day, I felt foolish, telling myself it had just been a mix of wind, branches, and paranoia. But as night fell again, the tension returned, thicker and heavier. I left the lights on in every room, hoping it would ease my fear. But the house seemed darker than ever, shadows pooling in every corner. Just after midnight, the knocking started again. This time it was louder, more insistent, moving from window to window in a slow, taunting rhythm. My heart pounded as I forced myself to ignore it, repeating the man's warning like a mantra. And then I heard something even worse. A faint whispering, barely audible, like a distant voice carried on the wind. It was coming from the direction of the windows, mingling with the knocks. I strained to make out the words, but they were too soft, too distorted, as if someone were speaking through water. I stayed like that for hours, clutching my pillow, fighting the overwhelming urge to look, to see who or what was out there. I could feel it watching me, its presence pressing against the walls, testing them, waiting for a weakness. The next morning, I was exhausted but determined to finish my week and leave this nightmare behind. As night fell, the dread returned, coiling around me like a vice. I'd barricaded myself in the bedroom, telling myself I'd just wait it out. But that night, the knocking started earlier, louder, more frantic. And then as I lay trembling in bed, I heard it, a voice, clear and sharp, calling my name. "Let me in," it whispered, a voice almost human, but too cold, too hollow. It called again, insistent, like it knew I was listening. My hand reached for the curtain almost instinctively, desperate to see who was out there, but I stopped myself, fingers trembling just inches away. The voice grew louder, almost pleading now, begging to be let in. It was saying things only I would know, words that struck deep, almost as if it could read my thoughts, my fears. "Please let me in," it said, the voice warping, twisting, like someone scratching their nails down a chalkboard. I stayed in bed, terrified, until dawn finally broke. I packed my things, ready to leave, feeling a strange pull toward the windows, as though something were calling me to look one last time. But I resisted, hurrying out of the house and locking the door behind me. The owner was waiting for me on the porch, as if he'd known I wouldn't last the week. He didn't look surprised when I handed him the keys, his face expressionless. What was it?" I stammered, needing an answer. He gave a slow, measured shrug. "Something that's been here for a long time," he replied, his voice flat. "It calls to those who listen, but once you look, once you let it in, it doesn't let go." I left without another word, feeling its gaze burning into my back as though it were watching me from the windows, waiting. To this day, I don't know what it was, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear that knocking, faint but insistent, like it's found me again, still waiting for me to let it in.